got us at 1:40 or 11:44, so we will.
You may be aware that Bill had to go home. He's feeling very poorly.
Oh no.
He's got a respiratory.
Well, I appreciate you all hanging around. And again, I'm Lee Curtis. I'm your canon to the ordinary. And part of my portfolio is to assist congregations in transition, like the one you are about to be in. We're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to kind of go from the big picture to the detailed. And I want, more so than anything I do today, I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to answer your questions. So I've really just got probably about 30 minutes worth of points that I think are important to discuss. And then, again, I want to make sure that I'm able to answer all of your questions. I've already, your vestry has heard a much more detailed version of what we're about to discuss today, and it's been a joy working with them. It's a shame that Bill Fanning is not feeling well, but he's been a joy to work with, and y'all have a good vestry. So, so I wanted to just start off there. Again, we're going to go from the big picture, from the macro to the micro. And I want to make sure that I've got your questions answered as best as I can. So one of the first big things to talk about is roles in the Diocese of the Rio Grande. What are the roles of who does what during transition? So what I am here to tell you, I know it's been done a number of different ways in the past in this diocese. But what I want to be clear that Bishop Hun and I are committed to is that your vestry is the body with the canonical authority to call your next rector. Now, Bishop and I can set some advice. We can advise, and Bishop Hun will ultimately have to consent to who your vestry nominates. But if your vestry, as they are already keen on doing, does the steps to discern a good call, we trust your vestry and we trust y'all to know the voice of your next rector. And as long as that person has a clear background check and continues to submit to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church, then we have no complaints. So canonically, the vestry nominates and will call your next rector. The bishop will honor that call. And so it is not, I am not coming here to tell you who your next person will be, nor will I send them to you. Your vestry will call. Now, what this does mean is that Hope on the Desert, although not yet, is soon to be back on the market. So what I want to talk about is what the market looks like. And unfortunately, I have to throw a bunch of scary numbers at you. So we are in the midst of a historic clergy shortage. There are 7 open full-time positions to every 1 clergy person searching for full-time work. That varies region by region as well. For the last 15 years in the Episcopal Church, we have had a ratio of 2 retirements to every 1 ordination. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. Is that in the diocese?
No, this is the whole church. Whole church. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Everything I'm talking about now is whole church, because when we're in transition, we're thinking about anybody who is validly ordained in the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Communion. If they are validly ordained in the Anglican Communion, they can apply here. So whether or not the immigration part of the process is there, they are welcome to apply. So we're talking about big picture in the Episcopal Church, 2 retirements to every 1 ordination every year for the last 15 years. The average age of ordination in the Episcopal Church right now is 55. 50 years ago, it was 30. And so what we're seeing is, like, I am one of the exceptions to the rule. I was ordained when I was 25. And that was kind of the rule earlier on, that we had younger ordinations with clergy serving for longer periods of time. The average tenure of a rector was about 15 years for the majority of the last 50 years. Right now, the average tenure of a rector is 6.5 years. So what we're experiencing broadly are fewer clergy, shorter tenures, shorter durations of service before retirement. So what that means for us is that we have to be strategic about how and when we work to make, to put Hope in the Desert's listing out there. We are required by canon to list your position, because it is a full-time position, for at least 4 weeks. There's no way we can get around that. But more so than what we're required to do, there are steps that we want to make sure that every congregation, not just Hope in the Desert, gave a variation of this speech last week at Taos, in Taos. I'll give another variation of it 2 weeks from now in Carlsbad. There are steps that are similar in congregations in transition that we want to make sure we do across the board. The first step, Hope, that you cannot miss is to celebrate the ministry of Dan Tootin among you. And celebrate it hard. No, that, yes, more of that. More of that. You can't skip this step. Dan has been with you 14 years? 16. 16 years. This building did not exist at the beginning of his ministry. The church that is here now is a church that you know how it looks with Dan leading it. Which means that you need to get a chance to say a good goodbye and to celebrate everything you have done, because in celebrating everything you have done, you'll go back and you'll remember what you did. You'll go back and remember what it was to run the capital campaign to build this place, what it was to be in this part of town, what it was to reach out to this community, what it was to see folks married here and baptized here and buried out of here. You'll remember those pieces, and coming to terms with that history is so important for understanding who you are as a congregation. So we've got to come to grips with who Hope is right now. Because if we understand who you are right now, then we'll have a sense of who God is calling you to be next. And if you have a sense of who God is calling you to be next, then you know the kind of person that you need to serve this community. So this summer, I know your vestry is working on gathering that feedback. I know you will be putting in the work to celebrate Dan well. I also know that your vestry wants to move as judiciously as possible to list your position. And that is absolutely okay. The standard timeline that most congregations are on is about a year from the time that your rector departs to the arrival of your new rector. Now, that is mostly because of the realities of congregational life. Your vestry wants to have your position listed this fall. And I absolutely support them in this. which means that they will be listening for your feedback, and it means that your attentiveness to their desire for your feedback is absolutely crucial. It is absolutely crucial. You, congregation, need to help the vestry know who you think in your heart hope is, who hope has been, and who God is calling hope to be. And your vestry, listening deeply to that information, will put together your congregational profile, your congregational portfolio. And with that intent listening, with the good discernment and listening of your vestry, we can have this position listed in the fall. What I want to say to that is, just because we list it in the fall does not necessarily mean you will have a call in the fall. It is entirely possible that you will. But this is one of the pieces that I want to make sure everybody is aware of. Because there are fewer clergy nationwide, means that your one might not apply at any given time. Now, I told you all in the sermon that I'm from Florida, right? Have any of you all fished with a cast net before? Have you seen that? Where you've seen the videos of people that have like the net in two hands, they have part in your teeth, and you got to do this whole like full body rotation to get it out there, pull up a ton of fish at one time. Transitions before, you were fishing with a cast net. You would get 20 to 25 applicants just for kind of existing out on the market. Now we're lucky if we get 3 to 5. So we're not fishing with a net, we're fishing with a line, which sometimes means you have to put it in for more time. Now you may get that bite immediately, like right off the gate. But be prepared. Be prepared for the possibility that it will take more time than you expect, than any of us expect. Okay? Because what we are fundamentally doing in this process is not hiring somebody, but listening deeply for who God is calling Hope in the Desert to be and who God is sending to meet that hope and meet that call. It may be that that person is already ready and willing to go. It may be we already know that person, know who that person is, not that they're called to be our next rector. We have good clergy here locally who I know want to work with you. But if we get too fixed on one particular outcome, and it's not the right one that we know and have prayed for God to hear us and for us to hear God, then we're setting everybody up, right? So, what I want to say with that is your vestry is looking to move judiciously given the realities that are around. We know that they are going to list in the fall. We know you will be receiving applicants in the fall. Anyone is welcome to apply. But what I want to just reframe the process from this idea that it is a hiring process to, from the time Dan announced his retirement to the time you call your next rector, your principal task is to listen deeply to who God is calling you to be so that you can respond to the voice of who God is sending you. And if you do that, it can go real quick. We can be done by Thanksgiving. It could be 2 years from now. But you've got a good vestry. You've got a good vestry who will make sure that you are well taken care of as long as it takes. Because transitions take as long as they take. Okay? So, Between now and when your application is listed, and I know your vestry is aiming to list this fall, task number 1, celebrate Father Dan's ministry. Task number 2, you, congregation, pray and listen deeply and let your vestry know what is on your heart and on your mind. I will continue working with your vestry. There are a lot of options for how to do this process well. I've discussed a couple of them with your vestry. And there will be kind of concrete ways that you can get your feedback to them. And you can have that conversation with them. But those are the 2 principal tasks right now. You cannot skip either one of those, no matter how hard we might want to. Because if we skip either one of those, then there's going to be that deep feeling in us that, Father Dan left and we got this new person and I didn't get to say goodbye, or I didn't get to tell him how much of an impact he had on me. I didn't get to really express this part of who he helped me become in God and what that means and who we're looking for. And all those pieces come out sideways later on down the line. Same thing, if the vestry thinks that y'all have given them feedback and congregation you're holding back, it's the same thing. The vestry will come present your next rector and say, this is the person who you said we want to have all of these qualities. This is the person who reflects the voice that you told us to listen for. And you've got a congregation full of people going, no, we didn't say that. Your silence, staying silent, either in celebrating Dan or in speaking to your vestry or in speaking to God, is a setup for failure. It is more important now than ever that y'all communicate with each other, particularly because the hope is to move judiciously into the fall. Okay? So, celebrate Dan, pray, listen, speak with each other. Your vestry will have concrete ways for you to be able to do that. The next thing that you want to do, and this is really when we get to the call of your next rector or your next priest in charge. You want to be ready to welcome that person. You want to go ahead and put it in your mind that even if this person is known to you, even if your next rector is somebody who you already know, they are not Dan. They do not know what Dan knows. They don't know your heart in the way that Dan does. And so you as congregation have to be ready to welcome them in as somebody who is their own person with their own ends. It may be that you get an application you don't expect from way outside the diocese, but this person is checking every box that you could say you want. That means you got to be ready to welcome that person, not just show them who Hope is, but show them what Albuquerque is, what there is to do to be ready to welcome them in. Okay, we are opening ourselves up for every possibility, because that's how God works. So, celebrate Dan, listen deeply to each other and to God, and be ready to welcome with genuine hospitality and openness your next rector or priest in charge. We cannot skip any of those steps. Doesn't mean we have to delay, doesn't mean we can't move judiciously. Can't skip those steps. All right, and that is your task, congregation, between now and the arrival of your next rector. Those three things: listen, or celebrate, listen, and welcome. There, I just wrote your next mission statement. You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
What is celebrate?
So I'll just I'll repeat the question. What does celebrating Dan look like? Is it a party? Is it a roast? Is it a that's a great question, and it's not one that I can answer for you. It's one that you all have to answer in and among yourselves. So a party of some kind. But more so than that, and this celebrating piece, there is a corporate kind of whole congregation element to it, but there is also an individual element to it. I can already tell you, however amazing it's going to be, there is going to be some amount of grief seeing somebody in that pulpit when Dan is not there. So what are the steps that you need to take to celebrate and say that goodbye in your own heart? That's one piece of it. But then what are the other steps? How do you party, Hope? What is the way that you do it? Right? I had a congregation, my first congregation, our deacon had a trailer smoker that he loved to. He was looking for like, hey, Vicar, you want barbecue for that one? I'm like, yeah, deacon. If I told you no, you'd pull the smoker up anyway. So like, we're just going to go ahead and do that. What is the way that you party? What is the way that you celebrate, Hope? I can't answer that question for you, but I can name the individual and the corporate piece of it, both of which are important. Oh man, Deacon Bert, God rest his soul. He was a good man. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know the mandatory retirement age.
Uh-huh.
And I'd also like to know what type of person are you finding applying for positions? Are these young people just starting out, or are they mid-experience and only have a few years until they are required to retire? What's your general
Okay.
view?
So just to repeat the question for those who are on the stream, what is the mandatory retirement age? And for the folks that we see applying, what is the profile that we see? Are they younger? Are they towards the beginning or into their career? What are some of the characteristics of who we see applying across the diocese? So the mandatory retirement has been talked about badly. We haven't explained it well as a church, and it's led to a lot of confusion. We are not talking about mandatory retirement in that it is the mandatory age at which you must stop working. 72 years old is the age at which you must begin receiving your pension. And because it is mandatory that you start receiving disbursements from your pension, the pension fund, in order to make it so that congregations can't just say, oh, well, because he has to receive a pension, we don't have to pay him as much. And then what you do is you create this incentive to keep a bunch of retirees in your highest level positions. If you do that, because it's good for the congregation, it's good for the retiree. What the church pension group has said is you cannot have a tenured position after 72. Rectors are positions with tenure. There is no way for a vestry to fire a rector without going through a very involved canonical process to do so. Your rector also cannot just leave without the vestry saying yes. The vestry actually canonically has to accept the resignation of a rector. What somebody can do after 72 is they can sign a year-to-year contract that's renewed every year by the bishop. But even then, that's tricky because we want to make sure that we're not keeping, in our positions that are able to pay full-time, we want to make sure that we're not locking in a group of people who with whom younger clergy cannot compete, because younger clergy are not drawing their pensions, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the how and the why behind 72. In terms of the folks who we see applying across the board, the two things I will say are consistent are we do tend to be getting clergy who are earlier in their career. The simple fact of the matter is everywhere across the diocese, and we've come a long way on this. When I became your canon in 2019, we had one of the lowest average clergy compensations in the entirety of the Episcopal Church. We were below Puerto Rico. We were the third lowest paying diocese in the Episcopal Church. And what that meant was, well, and part of that is because we had been relying on retired or semi-retired clergy for a long time, which artificially dropped the cost of what our congregations thought clergy should make. That has been coming up. That has been coming up. So we do not get, in the same way like many of the coastal dioceses do, we don't get the folks who are 20 years in, looking to run a large system and need a total compensation of between 150 and 200. What we do tend to get are folks who are earlier on in their career, who are looking for a place to learn and kind of start out from. And in that case, I think that fits New Mexico to a T. You come here, you learn, we teach you really well, and then you go somewhere else and you change the world, right? That we have a tradition of that as a state. The other folks who we routinely get are those who, the other thing that New Mexico does really well is you come here, you fall in love with it, and you do everything you can to get back here. So a profile, regardless of years of experience that we're seeing, is folks who have some connection to New Mexico, going back in their life, and they want to come back. And that's clergy who, are 10, 15 years in, kind of in the prime of their career. That's folks who are towards the end of their career. That's folks who are just looking for a quality of life move. So those are the two consistent pieces, folks earlier in their career or folks who have some either family or personal history in New Mexico trying to look to come back. That's what we see. Yes, ma'am. Yes, we are. I didn't exactly plan it to go this way, but we'll take it. We'll take it. Yes, sir.
I was Bishop Warden at the time we hired Paul.
Uh-huh.
And we had a singular focus, and that was preaching.
Oh. Because this is a longer question, let me make sure you get the microphone.
Okay, I'm Howie Tischler. I was Bishop's Warden at the time that we selected Father Dan, and I was in charge of the process from the congregation side. We had developed a profile, and the singular most important item in the profile was preaching. And that's what we went out with, and Father Dan was selected. And as far as I'm concerned, he satisfied that in spades all these years. Okay? Now, I would have a problem with identifying on the questionnaire what aspect that is your number one aspect in calling a rector. I would have two. Number one is preaching. Number two is healing. And we did have a healing program developed at the time Father was called, although we had it in inception. So I would ask question number one, how do we tell our vestry that we have two equal components for the selection? Do you have a reply to that? And then I have another question.
Well, so that's, I know this is one of the things that your vestry is actively discussing in terms of what is the best way to collect feedback. I always think, I actively encourage our vestries to not do congregational surveys. Because they take a lot of time to develop, and they tend to get lost in people's email, or they get lost in people's inboxes. I don't want to click this weird link. So I tend to encourage vestries to not do that, because it's not the best use of everybody's time. All of the ways that I recommend tend to be more conversational. And like I said, your vestry, I know, is working on that right now. They'll have the way to get that to them.
I had a question number 2, or item number 2 of my concern. We have a well-developed healing program here at Hope, but only a minority of the congregation participates. It worries me that the healing aspect of the Hope ministry will, because they're only a minority participating, will not get as high a rating as if the majority participated. Any comments?
So I want to, and it's Alan, right? Alan. Yeah, no, go. You can respond to the first one, and I can take the second, because it does bring up a good point. If you pass that back.
Well, I just wanted to say that Sue and I and Don Walker are working on a congregational profile, and that is both of those things are certainly things we're going to include in that. And I would encourage you to talk with me or Sue or Don about that, and we're certainly, that is certainly something very important that I'm aware of, that we need to include in how we present ourselves and how we interview and those types of things, what we are looking for. And the fact that, the fact that a smaller number of people may be involved in that, I don't think diminishes its importance, at least to me and to the congregation.
Well, and I want to say something as well about, in a congregation of y'all's size, with a rector being your one full-time clergy person, fundamentally we're looking for a generalist. And I want to encourage, I encourage all of our congregations in transition to not think about things in a zero-sum game, right? To not think about, if this person preaches really well, then they won't be able to administer, right? That's a dichotomy I hear a lot, right? Oh, fantastic preacher, could not budget their way out of a paper bag. Well, that's not an excuse to not do administration well. It just means that you know that this person, who has a broad portfolio, is not going to be able to do everything well all the time. And so you build up means of support. What's important is about how you work with that person and identifying those places where additional support is needed, right? So if you have somebody who has a strong theology of healing but is not gifted in healing prayer themselves, then you work within the body to lay out that structure for this group of people, this small but very important group, to the life of hope. Because here's the thing about clergy. We talk for a living, which means that we are really good at giving you the answer you might like to hear. So what I encourage, and I've spoken to your vestry a little bit about this before we get time to the interview, we'll have another conversation. So just asking somebody, is healing ministry important to you? Well, I'm going to make it important to me because I saw that's very important to you on your profile and I want this job. Rather than saying, what is your experience of healing ministry? What do you think about the gift of healing in the church? What role do you think it has in the life of a congregation? Then we start to pack out like somebody who can say, I have a strong theology of healing. I can tell you a little bit about that. Actual healing prayer beyond the anointing of the sick is something that I am uncomfortable with, but I would love to support that ministry, right? You take that answer on aggregate with all the other answers that this person gives and see if it lines up. So it is helpful to think about, to take a holistic approach to the individual rather than trying to say, this person must be strong on music, this person must be strong on preaching, this person must be, don't make it a zero-sum game. But say what is important to you and say what's on your mind. Yes, let me get the microphone.
I can speak pretty loudly.
Oh, well, it's for the folks on the stream. Yeah, unfortunately, you can't speak across the internet.
I have two questions. You spoke earlier about reaching into the Anglican communion.
Uh-huh.
So how far and broad into that communion are searches typically going? I mean...
we tend to receive 1 or 2 international applicants for every position. What I tell congregations up front, and certainly our vestry, if the vestry is doing the search, if it's a search committee, is the only thing a Zoom interview costs you is an hour of everyone's time, right? And that's one of the blessings right now is whereas before we might have seen an international candidate and said, nope, it's going to be an expensive proposition just to even talk to them. Now you can talk to them and see if there's a possibility. What I will say is that for an international candidate to come in, it adds about a year and $10,000 to the process, just in terms of immigration. Clergy come in on an R1, what's called an R1 visa, which is a specific category of worker visa. It's a religious worker visa. You all have heard about the problems in our immigration system, and we're experiencing processing times of a year to 18 months to receive an R1 visa. Plus, that unfortunately, and I keep working with the Episcopal Church on this, the sponsoring relationship is of the congregation to the clergy person. And so the congregation has to absorb the cost of paying for the immigration processing. We could get the Episcopal Church to take that as an umbrella organization, and that I'm working on that. That's my high horse. There's some really talented international candidates out there. Immigration is a solution to issues in the workforce in every other category. So if we receive international applicants, I check with with my counterpart in their diocese, just like I do if we receive somebody from within the Episcopal Church. We've gotten some really talented applicants from Mexico and Canada in the majority, also some from the Caribbean. It does add, like I said, about a year and $10,000 because of the immigration process, which, again, it's not my call to make. For the right person, is it worth that? That's a question that each congregation has to answer on its own. So, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And then my second question, and I'm not really sure how to word this, but given the fact of the scarcity of applicants and kind of the shrinking of churches, everywhere, are there any considerations currently within the diocese of combining churches? Is that a solution that's being considered?
We would do it if they asked us to. So if 2 congregations approach Bishop Hunn or I and say, Um, it doesn't make any sense for us to be apart. Like for example, out in the Big Bend, they're doing this in spades. We've got 5 congregations, 2 clergy. So Mike Wallens is the vicar out there, he's in charge, and then there's a curate, Katie Hudak. Their schedule is they're in Marfa at 9 a.m., they're in Alpine at 1 p.m., they're in Fort Stockton at 5 p.m. On Wednesdays, they're in Lajitas, and on Thursdays, they're in Terlingua. And they alternate those days, right? That only works because every one of those congregations bought into that schedule. What we have seen, not just in the history of this diocese, but in other places in the Episcopal Church, every time we have forced mergers, what we're doing essentially is killing one congregation. So neither bishop, we will not close a congregation unless they ask us to. We will not merge a congregation unless they ask us to. What we can do is identify as a possibility, we have 2 congregations, we have a clergy person who would be willing to serve both. It would mean either, you get communion every other week, or one of you moves your service time to an afternoon. Right? I put the possibility out there, and if the congregation wants to try it, then it's theirs to decide. But if that decision comes down from on high, then what we're doing is essentially killing a congregation. So kind of the same way with this here. This is hope. This is your transition. This is your game to play. I've played this game a lot, and I know a couple things. Bishop has played this game even more than I have. He knows a few things. We're just here to coach. We're here to advise, but fundamentally this is your game to play and this is your call to make. So that tends to be our approach overall, not just with transition, but across the board. Yes, sir.
I've been involved with a transition of different dioceses, and with that, the selection of a candidate first was that they became priest in charge, and after a year's time or 2 years' time, the vestry then made a decision whether to retain them as rector or not. Is that the kind of approach that the Rio Grande Diocese takes?
We don't take that as an across. There are some dioceses that are moving to that as an across-the-board approach. Here, I'll take that back. Just because, like I said, rectors canonically have tenure. So if you call somebody and it's not a good fit, and you called them as your rector, it's a really painful process to have to do early on in a relationship. Bishop Hunt and I tend to trust the process, though, and to leave it up to the congregation. What I will say, though, is running a condensed timeline in the way that y'all want to, my strong recommendation is that you do what we call a rector time certain. Other dioceses call it priest in charge. Because, and this is true for everybody, this transition is going to take about 3 years to settle out. It's going to take about 3 years for y'all to feel like this is really your person, and for that person to feel like this is really their church, right? And so what we just do is we say, we start you on a 3-year contract with an option to renew, basically is all that is, with an option to extend tenure after 3 years. I don't know if the vestry has, that's a bridge we will have to cross in terms of how we frame that. I've made that recommendation. If for whatever reason, let's say we list this fall and you don't find the person, we take a little bit more time. The longer things go, the more I think it could make sense to call a rector instead of a time certain position. But that's ultimately your vestry's call to make. And maybe the candidate too, because it does offer some, I've had candidates come in and say, no, I want this on a 3-year contract, because they don't want to go on, that's a, they get a 30-day out if it's not good for them. Let's say they've been burned somewhere else. So it can come from either side, but we're flexible with that. I want to make sure I've got all your questions. We're getting into that time on Sunday afternoon, I know. So, all right, friends, I just want to reiterate, as congregation, your tasks are to celebrate Dan and his ministry among you, to listen hard to each other and to God, and to get that information to your vestry in the way that they say is best for you to do so. And then we've got to be ready to welcome whoever God sends on whatever timeline God sends them. All right, we're hoping for a fall listing and a call by the end of the year. But even then, well, especially because we want to condense this timeline so much, you've got to be sure to attend to those three pieces: celebrating, listening, and welcoming in a shorter amount of time than this process would normally take. We can't skip those steps, but we can move judiciously through those steps. Okay? And as always, yes, ma'am?
When will we know who the candidates are?
You will not know who the candidates are. You will not know who the candidates are. Your vestry will know who the candidates are. And that part of the process has to remain confidential for two reasons. One is, well, the first and the most important reason is maintaining confidentiality through the search. What you want is somebody who is happy where they currently are, who is just trying to discern what God is calling them to next. And so you want somebody who's like, I don't need to jump ship. I'm not trying to run from something. I'm trying to see where God's calling me next, and maybe Albuquerque is it. Maybe this church, Hope in the Desert, is it. Your vestry cannot share with you. They can share things that they're excited about with candidates. They can say, oh, we have an applicant who has this wonderful healing ministry in their own church, and here's how they've developed it. What your vestry cannot tell you is the name of the individual, the gender of the individual, or where they currently serve. That is what that has to remain confidential to the vestry at all times. Because if your vestry tells you, oh, well, I can't tell you their name, but this amazing woman priest who is an associate in the suburbs of Chicago. Every single one of you can hop on Facebook, and it would not take you more than 15 minutes to find every associate at every suburban Chicago church, to narrow that down to who the women are, then to narrow that down to who the women are with compelling healing ministries who are associate clergy in the suburbs of Chicago. And then, because if you've already done that work, well, you know somebody who has experience, who knows somebody in the Episcopal Church in Chicago, and you hop on that phone call and say, tell me more about Jane out of Waukesha, right? Looks great. Well, then that person calls somebody who goes to that church, and the next thing you know, Jane's got a group of people that she was building a pastoral relationship with, that she's not even sure she wants to leave, who are now going, Jane, why are you trying to run? I thought we were building this up together. I thought we did this work together. Why are you trying to run? Those are the stakes of breaking confidentiality in this process. And when that happens, that affects the reputation not just of Hope, but of the diocese. And it makes it harder for me to go out and solicit candidates who are then going to go, no, your churches don't know how to keep me safe in this process. And they just won't apply. So confidentiality, your vestry has to keep that. The way this process will work is your vestry will tell me the timeline they want to list on. They'll get your portfolio done. They'll make sure your website looks the way they want it to look. And they'll say, we're going to list it for 4 weeks. Remember, we are required to list it for at least 4 weeks. At the close of that application window, I will send them all the names that I have received who I have background checked. The background check is simply this: do they have any criminal obstacles, or do they have any canonical obstacles? Are they fighting a criminal case where they are? Are they on probation where they're coming from? Or are they subject to church discipline in their diocese? If the answer is no to both those questions, I send the applicant to the vestry. I do not screen names beyond making sure somebody is eligible to serve. And then it's up to your vestry to go from there. But as the congregation, you cannot know any identifying information about the candidates. And I've already sternly warned your vestry about the importance of keeping confidentiality. Yes, ma'am.
So when you're talking about canonical,
Yes, ma'am.
are you talking about you're not going to send us somebody who doesn't believe in the resurrection or doesn't believe that Jesus is the only way? Those kind of things.
No, I will, if their diocese says that they are a priest in good standing and are not under discipline, then I will send you that name.
Okay. And I guess that's up to us to ask.
Yes, absolutely, which is part, again, of that listening process.
Okay.
Like, I hear very strongly in that there is a type of priest that you feel would not be a good fit, right? There's a theology that you feel would not be a good fit. That's why the congregational listening process, the congregational listening part is so important, and making sure they get that feedback,
Okay.
right? Because, again, behind that is, we really trust y'all to hear the voice of your next rector. And so I don't want to do any pre-screening beyond what is responsible to do.
Okay, okay, because you can be a good standing in the Episcopal Church and be totally way out there, so.
Yeah, there are folks who, you know, yeah, and that argument cuts both ways, and we have congregations on both sides of that, right? But that's where it is you. That's where we trust you to hear the voice of your next rector. Because I know who I think's good, but y'all might be different.
I don't think so, though. I think we're on the same page on that one.
All right, friends. Well, thank you for your time. Bill has my number. Dan has my number. If there is a question that occurs to you later that you really want an answer for, please get my number either from Bill or from Dan and call or text. My email inbox has a tendency to eat things, so call or text. But I'm available to any one of you at any time. Thanks so much.